Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. In today's video, we're going to be talking about creating a self-publishing budget. One of the most common questions regarding self-publishing is about cost. We have made a video in the past on the costs of self-publishing, but because that video is a couple years old, for the most updated and accurate figures, I'd recommend checking out our blog post, which I'll leave in the description. We update that every year since the numbers are always changing to keep it accurate. The cost of self-publishing does vary quite widely, but as an average, most self-published authors are going to spend between $2,000 and $4,000, but there are of course authors who manage to clock in much lower or much higher than that. Going forward into this video, try to keep these three things in mind. First of all, what's your maximum budget? Second of all, does your book have any unique requirements that might increase costs? And number three, where can you cut costs? So let's start with some general figures to keep in mind when you're making a budget. First of all is for editing. This is probably going to be the most substantial cost for most self-published authors. Keep in mind though, it does vary a lot depending on your book. Editing for a 40-page poetry chapbook is going to be much cheaper than for a 600-page fantasy epic. We've done these estimates for a 60,000-word novel, but adjust accordingly depending on your book. On average, you can expect about $1,400 for developmental editing, around $1,000 for copy editing, and around $700 for proofreading. This is all in American dollars, so again, adjust to your currency. However, genre does also have an impact on editing costs. Nonfiction and historical fiction have the highest editing costs because they involve a lot more fact-checking, and the editors need a more specialized background. Comics and children's books also have higher per word rates because the books tend to be much shorter. Editing costs are also greatly affected by how clean your manuscript is, so really the best way to minimize your editing cost is to make sure that your book is as clean as possible before you pass it along to an editor. Next up is cover design. There are many different styles of cover design that will probably set you back somewhere between $300 and $1,500. Cost will also depend on how experienced the designer is, how many rounds of changes or edits you need, and whether it's a print or ebook cover. For formatting costs, you can expect somewhere between $500 and $1,000. This again depends on how experienced your designer is, how long your manuscript is, and how graphically intense it is. So formatting a cookbook is going to be much more graphically intense than formatting a novel with no illustrations. However, if you are on a budget, I'd say formatting is probably the best place to cut corners. Although you of course still want the formatting to look good, it is probably the easiest thing to DIY. Unless your book has a lot of complicated graphic elements, you're probably capable of doing the formatting yourself. We've even got a free formatting tool that you can use that exports to ebook file formats, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. Next up is marketing. Authors often spend between $50 to $1,000 on marketing, but really there's a huge range here. It really does depend on your chosen strategies, but remember that unlike editing or cover design, marketing costs aren't a one-off thing. There's something that's going to evolve and be long-term across your book's lifespan. On one hand, this is a good thing because you can adjust accordingly depending on your budget at the time, but it also means you need to think a little farther in the future when making a budget. And there are plenty of low-cost marketing tactics that you can try if this is something you don't have a lot of room for in your budget. Social media, running a blog, mailing lists, even Facebook ads can all be done for free or for a fairly low cost, so they're good places to start. And if you start making more from royalties, you might choose to invest some of that back into your marketing. There's a lot to say about marketing, and since it's not the topic on the table today, I won't get into all of it. We do have a ton of resources on marketing, including other videos to get you started, a ton of blog posts, and even courses you can take. So we'll leave lots of marketing resources in the description. It's probably worth thinking about your marketing plan before or while you make your budget so you can properly account for your future marketing costs. Finally, there are just other little additional costs that you need to be aware of. These might be small or one-off things, but they can add up. These are things like maybe the cost of using an ebook distribution aggregator, which typically takes a cut of royalties, the cost of your ISBN, costs associated with your print-on-demand service, although some don't have any, or costs of, say, sample copies that you might want to order to send out as ARCs or as signed copies. We do have a quiz that you can take, it's pretty short, to help you kind of ballpark the cost of your book. So all that said, let's talk about how to budget it. Of course, the place to start is by thinking about your personal ceiling of what you want to spend. What's the most that you can afford or want to spend on this book? Remember that as a first-time author, it's very, very hard, if not kind of impossible, to predict your future sales. So you don't want to base this number on money you don't have yet, aka money you think you're going to be earning from this book. Don't set your budget expecting to earn thousands or even hundreds in royalties and thinking that you'll earn out your investment right away. As you start to publish more books, you might become more adept at being able to predict your future sales figures, but as a first-time author, it's very difficult to do. So be realistic with yourself and set your budget based on money you have now, not money you expect to earn in the future. Calculate your projected production costs and see if that exceeds your budget. There may be things your book needs, and so it would be hard to cut costs on. Say you're producing a cookbook. A cookbook is going to need photography and fairly extensive formatting. But say you want to have illustrations in your fantasy book. This isn't a need, it's not a requirement, it's just something on your wish list. And if you can't make room for it, it may be something that has to go if it's just not realistic for you in terms of cost at the moment. When it comes to these kind of wish list costs, things you want but don't necessarily need, you just have to determine if it's worth it for you to spend that extra money. If you can afford it, then you might want to go ahead and produce kind of the book of your dreams. But if you can't, sometimes you have to be realistic with yourself. It's probably more important that you pay for good editing services and a good cover than little extra bells and whistles that you can't afford at the moment. So let's just talk real quickly on how to cut costs in the event your production costs are going to exceed your budget. The best way to cut costs with editing is to do as much work on your book first as possible. Work with a critique partner or beta readers so the manuscript is really clean before you send it to your editor. Copy editing costs will go up depending on how much work the book needs, so do as much work as possible to minimize your copy editing and proofreading costs, as well as to minimize the number of developmental editing rounds that you might need. Typically, if you're working with a designer or an editor, a more experienced editor or designer is going to charge more. So you can work with someone who's a bit newer to the industry if you can't afford to work with someone with 20 years of experience. So that is how to create a self-publishing budget. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.